Lessons from 3 ERP failures, Apple's $500 million investment in AI, and why the end of big consulting is near. Those are just a few of the topics we're going to cover here in episode 211 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 211. This is the podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. We are the podcast that covers all the tech agnostic stuff you need to know about strategy, people, process, and technology as it relates to digital transformations, including ERP projects, supply chain management, and AI projects, among other things. With me joining, as always, is our co-host, Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Got a great show planned today. I'm excited for this. I love talking about troubled and challenged ERP implementations, and that's a big part of what we'll cover here today. We're going to start off by getting into some social media questions we've received recently. We're also going to get into some newsworthy topics, including Apple's $500 million investment in AI, and also a newsworthy topic around the federal circuit ruling opening the door for software vendors to sue the government directly. And that's a US-based story there. And then we're going to get into our first interview today, our primary interview today with Scott Janke, who is a Senior Director of Digital Strategy here at Third Stage Consulting. And he's going to be on with me to talk about ERP failure case studies. In particular, we're going to dive into the SPAR Group, Little, and Birmingham City Council. But we're also going to talk about the general lessons that all three of those failures, as well as other failures in general, lessons and takeaways that we can learn from. So we're going to cover that later in the show. And then finally, last but not least, later in the show, we'll talk about the end of big consulting and why its time is near. A very controversial topic, but one that seems to strike a nerve when we talk about it in social media. So we thought we'd talk about it here in the podcast as well. So all that being said, a couple logistical things. New episodes drop every Wednesday. Be sure to go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to see all the past episodes of the show that you might have missed. And you can also keep up with the upcoming episodes as well. And the show is produced by Major Tom Productions. So if you'd like to sponsor the show or collaborate with us, be sure to reach out to us. We've included contact information that you can reach out in the show notes here at Major Tom Productions. And the show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is the company that we work for, which is an independent tech agnostic firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. So before we get to our guest here today, Darian, tell us what you've got in store with social media questions.
Yeah, some great questions lately on social media. This first one is from a YouTube video that was recently published on your channel titled I Hate ERP. And the question is, so instead of ERP systems, what would the recommendation be? Yeah,
so in that video, I talk about how there's a dark side to ERP systems and the things that are sort of my pet peeves around ERP systems and the implementations of those systems. And so it's a great question. What if we're not going to implement ERP software, or if ERP software has more downside than upside for us as an organization, then what are our options? The good news is there's a lot of options. I mean, there's so many options nowadays that we didn't have 10 or 20 years ago. And one of them in particular is, certainly the best of breed composable ERP concept, whatever you want to call it. The newer term for it is composable ERP. But essentially what that means is instead of relying on one single system to handle your end-to-end business processes, you could have multiple systems that are very strong and better suited for any given part of your organization. And then you pull those systems together through, integration and architecture and whatnot. So that's one approach, is you could use best of breed or composable ERP. You can certainly look at microservices, which is sort of like a next step beyond best of breed. But when you look at microservices and really building and deploying niche technologies throughout the organization that handle exactly what you need and potentially are more suited for what you have. And then there's also, custom development. A lot of companies don't like to talk about it. Software vendors listening here today might think I'm crazy for even mentioning the words custom development, but it is still a thing. There is still value in custom developing solutions in cases where it makes sense. Now, if you're talking about creating a custom accounting solution, that's probably not a great idea because there's so many good systems out there that can handle accounting and financial reporting and things of that nature. But if you've got kind of a super unique secret sauce part of your business that you want to create a competitive advantage in, then you might want to, you probably are better suited to create something custom. So that's another option. But those are a few options you have. And then certainly, another option would be a lot of companies, like especially big government entities and bigger, more complex organizations. A lot of times they aren't in a position where they can move off their legacy systems anytime soon. So the question becomes, well, how could they modernize without ripping out those back office systems? And that's where companies like Palantir and Snowflake have really thrived, is they've gone into these legacy environments and created a semi-modern platform for them to integrate some of the data and workflows in their legacy systems. Now, to be fair and to be clear, that might be a short-term fix. It may not be a good long-term solution because eventually your core technologies are going to get outdated and you're going to need to replace them, but it is an option. You don't need to necessarily rip out all your systems all at once when you've got products like Snowflake and Palantir that could tie together the data and the workflows across those different functions. So those are a few examples of ways that you could work around ERP. And by the way, I'll give you one last option. You could do nothing with technology and focus on just optimizing what you've got. That's another viable option. Again, software vendors are going to tell you it's a terrible idea because you should be buying their software instead, the more recent versions of their software where they'll make more profit. But the reality is you could do nothing on the technology front and focus on just optimizing what you've got and get more value out of it. It's probably a lower risk proposition. It might be more viable for you as a company, depending on what your other priorities are. So those are a few examples of things you could do.
Yeah, lots of options there for sure. Another question we've gotten recently was, does the shortage of SAP resources have anything to do with how catastrophic those implementations are, and consultants, are they not interested anymore?
Yes. I don't know about the last part of that question, but I can certainly answer the first part of the question with a resounding yes, that the skill shortages and the demand that's being placed on the existing SAP consultants far outweighs the supply. And part of that is self-inflicted from SAP because they are sort of doing this forced migration of their legacy customers over to S4HANA in a pretty short window. They've got this 2030 deadline for all their legacy customers to upgrade to S4HANA before they lose support on their ECC or R3 systems. So that's creating this artificial spike in demand for S4HANA implementations, which is great for SAP, by the way. They're loving it. But that's not necessarily great for you, the customer. And it's certainly not great for you, the customer that's looking for qualified SAP resources, because now there's more demand that's outstripping that supply. So yes, when you've got a shortage of outside resources and you combine that with the fact that you're in a rush to try and implement before these arbitrary deadlines that vendors set for you, and you combine it with your competing priorities internally and other things you could be doing with your resources and your budgets and whatnot, that's creating sort of a perfect storm of challenges. And quite frankly, it's why there are so many catastrophes and why I think the number of SAP-related catastrophes are going to increase here in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great questions, though, from our social media lately.
Yeah, love them. I keep them coming, too, because it gives us a lot to think about and a lot to discuss here. So really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're going to switch gears here and get into the newsworthy articles of the day. Our first one today is the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit has overturned a prior ruling that blocked software companies from selling through resellers from suing the federal government over contract disputes. The case involved Avenue Technologies, which alleged that the government violated end-user license agreement despite purchasing through reseller Carasoft. Previously, the Sullivan Board of Contract Appeals dismissed Avenue's claims due to lack of direct contractual privity. However, the new ruling suggests that subcontractors with incorporated EULAs may have enforced rights against the government. This could significantly impact software vendors selling via resellers in federal contracts. Eric, with this, how could this ruling impact software vendors working with government contracts?
So just to clarify, is the article saying that resellers or VARs of the software, partners of the software vendors, they cannot sue the federal government? Is that what the ruling is saying?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, well, first of all, it's more likely that the software vendor, the system integrator, is going to get sued by the federal government. So I would think. I'm not sure what they would sue the government for, unless they don't pay their bills or if they want to countersue if they get sued. I guess that would be a likely scenario. So I honestly don't know what it means. That'd be a great question for us to ask Marcus Harris, who's a software attorney that we have on the show often. In fact, he's going to be on the show here in a few weeks and a few more episodes, so keep an eye out for him. But maybe that's something we ask him. I don't know what it means, to be honest, but anytime there's a limitation on one's ability to sue, I don't think litigious behavior is necessarily helpful or overly litigious behavior, but there are times where it does make sense to sue, and I think you should preserve that right. So I'm not, what little you've said or what little I know about it, I'd say I don't like the idea, but maybe there's a reasoning or rationale behind it that I don't understand.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's kind of a complicated, I guess, ruling, and I feel like there's a lot that goes to it. So Marcus probably would be able to speak better to it than either of us in this case. But I guess
he'd be able to answer it more rationally or objectively too than I would. I tend to have strong opinions, which would make me a terrible attorney. So, so I may not be the best person to answer it.
That's fair. I guess, let's see. One more question. From what we know, could this discourage software companies from using resellers, pushing them to contract directly with the government instead?
Yeah, I think it could. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it probably would, because they're, the system integrator or the technical partners are in a disadvantaged situation, as it relates to that. So I could see that leading to more software vendors contracting directly. And quite frankly, it might be better that way, especially when you're talking about the federal government or any large mega government agency. It probably does make sense to have the software vendor directly involved, partly because they're a bigger entity with more resources and that sort of thing. So that may be more suited for the government anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll have to ask Marcus maybe about it in a couple of weeks whenever he comes on. But we'll switch into our next newsworthy article of the day, which is Apple just announced a $5 billion investment in the US over the next 4 years. And it's kind of a big deal. They're building a factory in Texas for AI servers, which signals a major push into the AI infrastructure, which we've seen from other companies for sure and talked about on this podcast before. They plan to create 20,000 new R&D jobs, but they're not mentioning really anything of manufacturing roles. This could mean Apple is expanding beyond hardware and moving deeper into AI-driven cloud services. But the big question, I guess, is why now? Apple has historically outsourced manufacturing, so why shift AI production to the US? And with this level of investment, are they gearing up to compete with Microsoft and Amazon in cloud AI? I guess I'll let you answer that, and then we'll maybe get to some other questions.
Yeah, I think that they are certainly trying to compete with some of the other big technology providers. As far as why they move it to the U.S., I imagine it probably has something to do with data privacy and data protection and that sort of thing. If when you talk about AI, you're accessing so many different data points, and there's so much data being processed that it would make sense you'd want to have that, in your home country. And certainly not offshore that, especially if they're assuming that, government, we were just talking about the government a moment ago. If the U.S. government, for example, is going to use that AI platform for whatever reason, then chances are pretty high it needs to be that data, and that data center needs to be in the U.S. physically in order for that to fly. So it seems like good reasons for them to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing, Apple has seemed to more so focus on hardware in the past. Do you think that this AI investment means they're shifting more towards cloud-based services?
Yeah, I think it sort of continues a movement that they've been on, or a trajectory they've been on with cloud and AI in general. I mean, if you think about it, Siri, when you say "Hey Siri" on your phone, and then my phone just lit up as I said that because Siri picked up. But Siri was an early AI, not platform, but there's an early use case of AI, and even their Apple Music, with the intelligent, recommendations of music, and when you go on your phone and you ask it to play a song, it'll keep playing other songs like it, or that other people like it. So they've been in this AI trajectory for a while, maybe a bit more rudimentary than where they're headed now, but I think it makes sense for them to continue that evolution as a company away from hardware, which they've been doing for a while now.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any, I guess, predictions or insight, maybe not insight, but predictions into what Apple might be planning on doing to become a bigger player in the AI-driven cloud computing space?
Well, if I had to speculate, I would assume that it has something to do with the fact that they have so much consumer data that most other big tech providers don't have. And so, you think about the iPhone and the proliferation of the iPhone and the market share that device has. That's a massive amount of information that they're tracking of all of us, myself included. The hundreds of millions or billions of people throughout the world that are using iPhones. They're capturing data on those people, and they're capturing not just data on the individuals, but they're also capturing sensory types of stuff as far as locations and whatnot. So there's a lot of data that being captured there. So I think it makes sense for them to really leverage that and scale up the use of that data, and the processing of that data, and AI is a perfect way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, if Siri can become more like ChatGPT, that would be amazing.
Yeah. It's it's amazing to me how bad Siri is compared to ChatGPT. But I did notice I just updated my iOS a couple weeks ago, and I noticed now Siri integrates with ChatGPT, and it'll give you the option to search on ChatGPT, which is much more beneficial in most cases than the bland or wrong answers that I get from Siri half the time.
Yeah, I know. I feel that. But yeah, some good topics today, and I'm excited to get into this conversation with Scott.
Yes, we're going to talk about ERP implementation failures, and we're going to hone in on 3 in particular, but there's going to be some general patterns and lessons we're going to talk about as it relates to these 3 case studies. But these same lessons are going to apply to many other failures out there. So we're going to talk in particular about Spar Group out of South Africa. We're going to talk about Little out of Germany, and we're going to talk about Birmingham City Council out of the UK. So 3 different ERP implementation case studies. 2 of them involve SAP. 1 of them involves Oracle. We're going to talk about some of the lessons from those failures, and take audience questions as well. So be sure to stick around. We'll be right back. We're going to talk to Scott, and then later in the show, we'll talk about why I think the end of big consulting is near, and what I think are major problems and flaws with their business model that's going to lead to their demise. So not to paint too bleak of a picture of what's to come on the show. I hope this isn't too negative of an episode. I feel like we're talking about failures. We're talking about the end of big consulting, talking about Apple gathering all this private information about us. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here that we'll try to keep it positive throughout the rest of this episode. But that all being said, we'll bring on Dr. Scott Janke from Third Stage Consulting here in just a moment. We're going to talk about your ERP implementation failure case studies. We've got a lot more to cover here in this episode, so be sure to stick around. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 211. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com, and you can also see past episodes of the show at that same website, transformationgroundcontrol.com. And this is the podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. It's the tech-agnostic view of the strategy, people, process, and technology aspects of transformation. So thanks for being here today. Show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And speaking of Third Stage Consulting, we're going to bring on our next guest from Third Stage Consulting. He is a senior director at Third Stage Consulting Group. He also oversees our expert witness practice, which is to say that he oversees the part of our company that deals with ERP failures and helps remediate and testify in court as it relates to those failures. So we're going to talk about three particular case studies, Birmingham City Council, Spar Group, and Little. But we're going to also talk about just general failure lessons and patterns, even beyond that. So with all that being said, Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for being here. And this is a fun conversation. This is always one of those conversations where you could view it as a really negative, kind of a buzzkill sort of conversation, or you could view it as a hey, let's take some lessons here from these failures that we see in the marketplace. But before we jump into that, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then I'm going to ask you a little bit about what you do here at Third Stage.
Sure. Usually start off with longtime consultant. I after graduate school, I got into consulting pretty early and have been either in a consulting role with some of the big four and some boutique firms as well, or in some operational roles. So I've been a COO and VP of operations as well. So when we engage with clients, I can put myself in their seat of some of the challenges and issues that they go through when they look at large system selections and implementations. I have spent some time in academia as well. I've been a professor at UT Dallas, running a master's program and speaking on the topics of operations management and project management. So it translates quite well into what we do here at Third Stage.
Yeah, you have such a unique background. I don't know that I know anyone that has that triangulation of industry, consulting, academia. You kind of have it all the angles covered there, which is super interesting. So tell us about you oversee our expert witness practice here at Third Stage Consulting. Maybe tell us a little bit about, first of all, what is an expert witness for those that may not know, and what does that entail as far as overseeing that practice?
Well, I guess good for us, but bad for the industry is that when some of these ERP implementations go off the rails, or even post go live, they don't perform as planned, litigation typically gets involved. And so when attorneys are clashing with each other as opposing counsel, they typically reach out to firms like us and seek out experts that are knowledgeable about the industry, knowledgeable about what are successful and unsuccessful implementations, and hire us to engage and look at essentially all the breadcrumbs of the project and try and decipher not necessarily who's at fault, but more about what are all the challenges and problems that have shown themselves throughout the project that didn't stop the project or didn't pause the project. The project just kept going and ultimately failed. So we come in and look at those breadcrumbs and try and piece together where we think essentially the train went off the rails and the client ultimately was on the hook to pay fees or challenges in the business operation.
Yeah, very interesting. And we're gonna actually dive into 3 specific failure case studies here today. We're gonna talk about Spar Group, which is a South African retailer. We're gonna talk about Birmingham City Council in the UK, and we're gonna talk about Lidl, which is a grocery retailer in Germany. We're gonna kind of dive into each of those 3 case studies, and this is public information that we're sharing in these 3 specific examples. These are not clients of Third Stage Consulting, just to be clear. Because usually, quite frankly, we can't talk about the cases we're involved with. So we have to pick these public-facing ones that we're not involved with to be able to discuss them in any sort of detail. But before we get into those specific case studies, we're going to come back after the fact. We'll come back and talk about what some of the general lessons are and that sort of thing from those 3 case studies. But just to start, if we forget those 3 case studies for a moment and just look at all the failures that you've seen either as an expert witness and or helping with project recovery. That's another part of what we do, is helping get these projects back on track that have gone off the rails. But before we dive into the case studies, what are some of the general themes you see or general factors you've identified that most contribute to ERP implementation failures?
Yeah, I came up with this saying. It's been around for a long time, but it actually sums up quite a bit. Is the concept of measure twice, cut once. And I think what we see in a lot of these expert witness cases or assessment cases for projects that are in flight now that are having challenges is that the organization itself, either under the pressure of a software vendor or from their board or executive team to move forward into a massive ERP selection implementation sooner than they should. And when we look at projects midstream, or if we get called in after the fact, after something's gone live and has failed, we tend to see most of the challenges, the bulk of them, up front. We say this a lot in project management, and I said this in my lectures as well, is that the planning phase is by far the most important, even though it doesn't produce the fruit of an implementation. It is where it's the easiest to make changes and the least expensive to make those changes. So organizations tend to be so eager to get to the end that forget how important it is to start it off as slow as possible. And then once you have the direction and the team set up, then you can move forward as fast as is feasible. But usually they skip the planning phase. They move forward. They don't cover the requirements. They don't understand the impact of their customers and start right off. And that tends to start that snowball effect of rolling down the hill, of getting larger and larger. And at that point, it becomes a little bit of a blame game. And we can talk a little bit about that on some of those cases that you're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So it's the people and it's the planning. It's those 2 biggest areas that we see typically start the process.
And the irony of that is that software vendors and system integrators, generally, it's in their best interest for you, the client, to skip what you just said. If I can get you to start the implementation, start designing, building tech now, I can sell you the software faster. I can get my technology consultants billable faster. So that it's kind of in everyone's best interest, except for the clients, for you to skip everything you just talked about, for you to ignore that stuff. So, and that's the weird reverse part of the whole industry. Yeah,
and to hammer that home even more, I think that a lot of clients, again, whether it's expert witness cases that we are engaged with or our own clients through an implementation, they get charmed by a one-off software vendor pursuit. Everyone has problems, so when they get a call from a software vendor and says, "Hey, if you have this problem, we can help you," I'm like, "Hey, we do have that problem. Why don't you help us?" Without doing proper due diligence of, are there other players out there that might be a better fit for us? Is there a little bit more rigor in understanding how close their software fits our needs or not? They just love being pursued by a software vendor, taking them out to dinner, go to a conference. All of a sudden they're signing a contract, and halfway through they're like, I think we probably should have talked more before we started this project.
Yeah.
So kind of full circle of it's in the vendor's best interest to move forward fast. And usually the client is unaware of how important it is to say, stop. Let's talk to a couple more vendors. Let's talk about requirements, whatever those might be. And let's just get started, right? It's slow it down, slow it down.
Yeah. And to your point, you don't see the tangible results in the planning. So it's easy to say, well, there, I'm not making progress if I spend, say, 3 months on the planning stage or 6 months or whatever it is. That's 3 or 6 months that I've quote unquote lost, whereas I could just be designing, building, testing stuff now, and I can see and touch and feel the software. So it sort of makes sense in some ways why we would gravitate to that, because we're human and that's the more tangible part of the project.
Mm-hmm.
But the more important parts of the project are the things you can't see or touch or feel. And it all comes out in that planning phase, which we'll get to here.
Yeah, and I think that usually when we have conversations like this, the idea of agile software development comes up. Like, well, that's the whole purpose, is to spend less time planning and more time doing. But if you look at an enterprise-wide system implementation or an ERP implementation, they don't lend themselves well to a full-on agile project. One, for two reasons. One, it's so monumental in the changes that implementation is going to have on the organization. You need to have stronger and more enforceable documentation and approval stage gates. But more importantly, is agile for a complex project like this will only work, in my opinion, in my experience, for an organization that has already adapted that type of methodology. If an organization is completely foreign to the concept of agile development, having a software vendor come in and say, don't worry about it, you don't have to worry about it, it's for us, that usually gets off on a wrong foot as well. And I think we've mentioned this a couple of times in previous conversations, but we typically see system integrators transform from a rigor of a waterfall approach up front to an agile midstream, because it's easier for them. They don't have to do the documentation, and they start kind of, and I hate to say winging it, but the client is really unaware of what is happening because there's not anything that they can review other than potentially a mock-up of a screen or a functionality that doesn't necessarily come to fruition in testing.
Yeah.
And by that time, it's a little too late.
Yeah. Squishy is the word that comes to mind. It makes for a squishy. It's a technical term, but it means you can't get
I like it.
The agile approach is sort of squishy. We're not documenting everything. We're winging it, like you said. And it is a good cover, a good front to be able to get away with that, because you can say, well, waterfall sucks, and that's why all these projects fail. So we're going to go agile. And, in my opinion, agile makes things worse when not done in moderation.
Excellent.
Then Amy's got a comment. Sorry to block your face with this long comment here, Scott. But Amy on LinkedIn says, highly skilled project management with a methodology that is robust but can accommodate organizational nuances is so undervalued by many clients. One size does not adequately fit all scenarios. So that's a very good point. And I think, that we'll get into this, but, this sort of one size fits all, best practice approach to ERP implementations creates, in my opinion, a lot more problems than it solves. But we can dive into that as we get through these case studies here. So I want to do this, Scott. I'm just going to pop up this news article here. I'm not going to leave it up, but just to sort of set the context here for what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about Spar Group, which is a retailer. This article says they're based in South Africa. I actually posted a video about this case study, and I got a lot of heat, a lot of flack for saying that they're a South African retailer, but a lot of people said they're a Netherlands-based retailer, which there's a South African division of Spar Group for certain that they're talking about here, where they failed in their implementation. So Spar Group implemented SAP. So they implemented, and they just recently, this is a recent case study here in the last year. I think the article here is just from earlier this year, but they had a pretty significant failure with their SAP project. It resulted in substantial financial losses. What were some of the primary issues in the case, just from what we've seen in public record? What were some of the primary issues in this case, and how could they have been prevented, in your opinion?
Yeah, this is actually, and not to debate whether they're South African or from the Netherlands, but how they operate in parts of South Africa is that they're actually a vertical integrated distributor. So the group that implemented SAP was actually the distributor to retailers of the same name. And so the challenge that they had in driving what the ultimate result of this post go live work was that they lost sales because they didn't necessarily see what they're calling the margins of their product line in the new SAP dashboard, and that kind of raises a lot of concerns and questions around that. Obviously, the story doesn't go into detail of how they started. But that's one of those things that if you took the time up front, you probably should have realized whether something as important as looking at margins on your product line would be sufficient or
Yes.
not. It's not one of those things that should be a surprise. But because of the inner workings between the distributor and the retailer, which are essentially in the story the same, having them be part of the process up front probably would have potentially highlighted that deficiency earlier. But one of the things that we see is, and certainly the market is saying this more often than not, is that this idea of a single ERP to solve all your problems is no longer viable in most organizations, especially those that have complex systems or have been around for a long time and have entrenched processes. So there could have been easily an opportunity potentially to deploy SAP as the base of their enterprise functionality, but then looking at a different dashboard to solve that problem. So if they said that, we're going to choose SAP, we're going to choose another software vendor, and everything is going to live in that, that starts becoming one of those shoehorn functionality into something that may not be the best for this organization.
Yeah.
And in fact, we are working with an active client right now that tried that same philosophy 2 years ago, and it didn't work. And so one of the things that we initiated as they hired us to be part of the PMO group, is to look at other applications outside of the ERP to solve those essentially secret sauce processes, right? In many cases, finance and accounting are pretty much, as long as they're accommodating regional requirements from a localization, taxation, and the like, most can use it out of the box with some configuration. But if it's a dashboard, if it's order management system that is very unique in what they are winning business at, maybe that the ERP is not the best solution for that functionality. Yeah. And so, not knowing the full details of the SPAR implementation of SAP, were they trying to do that? Were they trying to put everything into SAP and still went to the point of going live, and yet after go live, they're saying stuff like, the dashboard doesn't provide us visibility to our margins? That seems odd.
Super odd. Yeah.
And I think most, and for the folks that are mentioning project management on the chat, most of the time in these implementations, they skip the planning phase as fast as possible. They move into excruciating execution of the project because they're learning as they're going. And then because they are time sensitive or want to go live, let's say in a particular fiscal year, they skip or truncate testing and training. Mm-hmm. And so there may be flaws in the application about to be deployed, but because they're so eager to go live for whatever reason, they let things go into production, and then they have no time to recover from disasters like what SPAR is indicating in this story. Is, if risk management is a key thing for you, you cannot disrupt your business at all. Incorporate a lot more testing and let the go live delay if that is a key thing for you.
Yeah.
So obviously in this case, they probably shouldn't have gone live if they had known something like this was going to impact their business as much as it has.
Yeah. I mean, you hit so many good points there. I mean, the first thing you mentioned around testing. You should have known. When I say you, I don't mean you, Scott. I mean if you're a smart group, you should have known that pricing margin analysis is really important to your business, and you should have tested that. And if you did test it the right way and thoroughly, and you documented and you corrected and remediated issues you identified during testing, if you did all that, those test cycles, and you had the scenarios laid out the way they should have been laid out, you would have caught this. I mean, you would have known that the margin analysis doesn't work for us, and you would have fixed it. It may have delayed the go live, to your point. It may have pushed things out, but you at least would have gotten it right. And it probably would have been a lot cheaper just to spend the extra time and money to fix it and push off the go live than it would be just to go at it and go live anyway. I'm curious to hear.
And just so everyone doesn't, one more thing, sorry, if you don't mind. I haven't been on one implementation where the product is defect free at go live. So let's be clear about that. There will be problems that go into production. The importance of project management and leadership approval is, what are you allowing to go into production?
And how big is that risk?
Low, medium defects, fine. Yes, exactly. So this would have been a critical defect that you wouldn't have allowed to go into production.
That's a great point. We're not seeking perfection here. It's not going to be perfect no matter how hard you want or try. It's a great point. And if this was like a kind of an exception, an exception one-off business process that we didn't fully test during the test cycle because it's a one-off rare business process, that does happen, right? You're not going to test every single possible scenario. But something as core as margin analysis, especially for a distribution company, you kind of look at who they are. Distribution companies generally don't have high margins. Usually their margin of errors, or the margin in general, is lower, which makes for a lower margin of error in terms of efficiency and that sort of thing. So I think those are good points there that you bring up. I'm curious to hear from the audience, though. I'd love to hear, as we're going through this conversation here, we're going to dive into we're kind of doing a flyover view here of these 3 case studies, and then we're going to come back and talk about the common themes across all 3 of them. But I'd love to hear from the audience here what you think the biggest key or keys to success versus failure are. We're kind of diving into this here today. We're going to get into it, but I'd love to hear the comments from the audience. What do you think? If you had to pick 1 or 2 things that are just absolutely critical to avoid failure, what do you think they are? I'd love to hear your feedback here. All right, so we'll come back to this. We'll get into some of these nuances and patterns across the 3, but I want to pull up another one here, another recent failure, and there's so many to choose from. I mean, even just as a side note, even as we were preparing for this, so I send, when we have a podcast guest on, I try to send the questions either Thursday or Friday the week before. So I send you these questions, and then it was literally later that day that I sent you the questions. There was another failure that someone on our team forwarded to me, and it was the SAAQ in Canada. They spent over $1 billion on this big, massive failure. And so my point being, there's always new failures coming up, and I wanted to kind of throw in last minute, hey, let's talk about this big SAAQ case study, but I didn't want to throw you off at the last minute like that. But point being, there's just so many of these case studies that we hear in the news. You would think over time people sort of learn lessons and start to fix the way they're doing this, but it's the same old crap that they've been doing for the last couple of decades.
And when we get called in for assessments and projects that are about to go off the rails, and they call us midstream, I have that same perspective every time we kick off. Is like, how are we here again?
Right.
And I think the only challenge we have is ourselves, right? When we look at this stuff, most of the time the technology will work, or the methodologies will get the project done. It's the human nature of things, right? It's people who are at the beginning of their career, they have no idea what they're about to get into. It's people at the end of their career who don't really potentially care how it goes, and everyone in the middle. And as long as there are humans involved in organizations, we're going to trip over ourselves over and over again. And no matter how much great advice we give to clients at the upfront, the idea of a selection of a system, the same attitudes come in of, well, we have to get it done by May. Well, why? Shouldn't drive the project. Or I like this vendor. I went to their conference and I signed the contract already. And you're just like, here we go again.
Yeah.
Right. It's just, get yourselves out of the way and do things methodically, and it will get you out of jail more often than not.
Yeah, just because they took you backstage to meet Bruno Mars at the conference where they had Bruno Mars perform doesn't mean that that's a good that's a good software for your organization. Um, here's I'm gonna
You bet.
get to a couple comments here from the audience here. Amy on LinkedIn says, and where's the fit gap analysis? How does something pass testing without an idea of the impact past go live? That's a great point. Salvador on LinkedIn says the planning phase is the most important stage of the implementation. Cedric says testing is most important. Yaz from YouTube says testing as well. Here's an interesting comment. Derek on YouTube says clear and tangible expectations of all stakeholders. That's a really good one. Sort of that clarity and alignment, just being on the same page with what it is you're trying to accomplish. Salvador says a lot of testing scenarios, not just testing, but a lot of testing scenarios, which is a good point. RR on YouTube says respect for covering this topic. So thank you for all the great feedback there. So this is City Council, Birmingham City Council in the UK, which is Europe's largest local authority, had a £216.5 million loss over their Oracle system implementation. Part of why I wanted to bring this one up too is not only is it recent, not only is it government, which government tends to have some of the biggest failures that we see, but also because we want to point out that failure doesn't necessarily correlate with vendor. We talked about SAP a moment ago, Spar Group. It's easy to pick on SAP and say, well, SAP has all these big failures, but SAP also has a lot of really big clients. So you're just going to hear about their failures more commonly than you might others. But point being, even Oracle fails and others, we can pick any software vendor out there and we can find you some failures and some case studies of what not to do. But in this case, they tried to implement Oracle. And in this Oracle rollout, they had severe challenges, including cost overruns, operational disruptions. What lessons can other public sector organizations or private sector, it really doesn't matter whether you're public or private sector here, but what are some of the lessons that organizations can take from this particular case study?
Yeah, what really got to me, and it relates to other projects that I've read about that have failed, not just software, but even construction projects. There was a sense in this story that there was a fear potentially of communicating to leadership that there was a problem in the first place. That the status of the project was probably green almost throughout the project until it actually got off schedule. But it seemed like there was a sense that we couldn't tell the real story of the project status during the engagement. And that then goes back to that human concept again of, did people fear that they would get fired or that they would be chastised in public, or did the leadership tell the project management, don't tell me anything unless it's about to stop? Right. And so this thing progresses forward. In fact, we actually had an expert witness case a couple of years ago where this was part of the challenge. When we go into an expert witness case, we obviously get all kinds of email correspondence, documentation, even versions of one document. So we'll see 3 different edits or additions of a document. And we can see what they're adding and taking away. The cases, it wasn't until the 11th hour that the project team actually had to kind of fall on the sword a little bit and say, we can't go live for all these reasons. But it really started a year and a half earlier. And so we tried to dig into why was there the fear that you can't tell the true status of a project so you can make course corrections. And so that kind of kept coming back in the story that there was this inability to truly project real status to leadership so that, again, informed decisions can be made and course corrections can be made. And in fact, we've stressed that enough to our clients when we get brought in midstream, where even the client will tell us, is it really green? Is it really yellow? Tell me the real story, because we can't do this again. So that it makes me proud, I guess, in a sense that they're actually listening to us, and they're actually very concerned of, is this the true status of our project? The reason I mentioned a construction project is I used to live in California, and they've been building this high-speed rail for decades, and it's billions of dollars over budget. And you just sit there and wonder, how did it get to this point? And you realize there's probably a lot of storytelling of it's their fault or our fault, but it's still going. It's still going to happen. And there's no benefit to anyone unless somebody, again, is fearful of their job. Just tell the real story, and then change and make those decisions that are necessary. It's not an easy process. We tell clients right up front, implementations of any enterprise system is not an easy process. There will be hiccups. There will be problems. There might even be some showstoppers here and there, but make everyone known of what's the challenges at stake and make those decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are such good points, because a lot of times we see this, it's kind of in slow motion with clients, or especially in expert witness cases where, to your point, the status reports all green, everything looks great. And then boom, all of a sudden, oh man, we got a bunch of red here. And, we're failing testing cycles, or, people aren't ready for the go live. And it appears as though, wow, all this stuff, this train wreck just sort of happened.
Right.
The reality is this stuff accumulates over time. This doesn't happen overnight. And the problem is, you see these sort of, back to the perverse incentives. You've got a system integrator and software vendor in there that's got two things going against you, the client. One is that they are incentivized to sort of hide any real risks or problems or warts with the project or with their software. The second part of it, which is probably even harder to get your arms around, is the fact that your software vendor and your system integrator, if they're the ones managing this project, they're looking at things through the technical lens. They're looking at like, hey, the software works. And in the case of we just talked about Spar Group a minute ago, I would suspect that the pricing margin analysis features of SAP works. I mean, SAP has tons of clients that are using that feature. So we know it works within S/4HANA, but it didn't work for Spar Group because they had a different need, or they had a different way that they needed to analyze that. And I think that's where we get in trouble, is we view it from the technical lens and say, yeah, everything's good, looks good and it works, but you look over at the business and it's not okay. And that's those two things combined to create like a huge blind spot for clients. How do you, this might be a self-serving question. In fact, it is a self-serving question. How can technology agnostic advisors like Third Stage, how can they help uncover some of those risks before they become sudden last minute red status reports?
Yep. It's and for those that are listening, Third Stage is not a system integrator. But we have resources available to us that know all the ERP applications out there. So our discussions with potential clients focus on us being the business advocate in an implementation. And what that means is most clients don't have a super strong project management group, first of all. And even if they do, they might not have gone through an ERP implementation ever in their careers. And so when we get brought in, 2-3 people, we are kind of the tiebreaker in a lot of meetings and transfer of communication, so that we can, and this is a technical term, we can call BS on either clients not providing information, even though they're telling the vendor they are, or the vendor shaking their head and saying, we understand your requirement, and we kind of stand back because hopefully we know the client better. We can sit there and go, I don't think you understand the requirement that you just shook your head saying, I understand. So we help facilitate the improved communication between all parties, when in many cases, and I would say this almost as a 98% chance of when we get brought into an assessment project, that it's been the client and the SI only. And they think they're talking, they think they're communicating, they think they're understanding where the project is, until we come in and realize both are lying, or they just don't know the truth. And so having us, any kind of third party system agnostic group like Third Stage, we help kind of fill in the gaps to make sure that if you say it's going to be a 1.5-year project, you're going to get a 1.5-year project. And that actually is a big driver of some of the challenges we see in expert witness cases. Is, let's say a lot of companies are at end of life for their current ERP. They've been on it for 20 plus years. So they need to migrate to a new ERP. But when they hear firms like Third Stage talk about digital transformation, they say, hey, that's a great concept. So not only do we have to replace our ERP, we're going to throw in a whole bunch of other work in one single project. And we're going to do everything. We're going to do process improvement, process changes, org changes, new systems, and we're going to be perfect at the end of this project. But what it ends up happening is it's a 3-year project that turns out to be 6, right? And that does no one any justice. And so our recommendation is to have tighter projects, have parallel projects if necessary, but don't lump everything into one single project and say you're on a transformation course. We advise our clients, it is multiple projects over multiple years to get to a state where you can say, I'm really proud of where we are today. So the bigger, the longer the project, the more prone it's going to have to be a failure.
I'm here with Scott Janke. We're talking about ERP implementation failure case studies, but we've got a lot more to cover. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. I've included a link to a video right here that describes Third Stage in a bit more detail. It talks about our story, our history, our philosophy, our clients, our service offerings, and that sort of thing. But in general, what Third Stage Consulting does is we're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting provider. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 211. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And you can also learn more about Third Stage Consulting, which is a sponsor of the show, by going to thirdstage-consulting.com. And the show is produced by Major Tom Productions. We're here with Scott Janke. We're talking about ERP implementation failure case studies. Let's dive back into the conversation. Here's a comment from Amy on LinkedIn. She says, lack of prioritization of experienced client-side project management, change roles coupled with a client that clearly handed the project responsibilities over. Successful projects are never issue-free through the process, but they succeed because the clients free their SMEs to bring their organizational expertise and the partner brings solution expertise. And I think this is a great point because a lot of organizations, and not just in the public sector, not just big organizations, we see it with small and mid-sized companies too. A a lot of organizations and project teams feel this need or want to sort of abdicate responsibility for the project. And they think, hey, you're the SAP expert, you're the Oracle expert, you're the Microsoft Dynamics expert or whatever. Come in and manage this project for us. Well, yeah, that they are experts in technology, but it's like hiring a plumber to come build your house for you. It just doesn't make sense. And you wouldn't rely on a plumber to build your entire house for you, but yet that's what we do in these big, massive digital transformations. So is that something you see often too, where you don't have that right balance of outside support, which you do need, but you also need that internal support? You have to have these internal resources that take ownership and accountability for the project, but yet a lot of clients
Absolutely.
don't do that.
Yeah, and it's we see this often as well. You have an executive team that fully supports what gets presented to them from a project management standpoint. They understand the case for change. And then you have the workers who might really understand their processes and get down to the minutia of, I need the functionality to do this, or I need the result of this process to give me that. And then there's a chasm in the middle. And these organizations think, again, that they can turn over the keys to a very experienced system integrator and go, just fix it all, right? And it takes a lot more work than that. And part of this third-party assistance is we help fill that gap, because we can see leadership saying, yes, go tell my people to do this. And then the people go, you don't have the right to tell me to do this. Let my boss tell me that. And there's this back and forth that keeps going on. And we help kind of communicate a little bit better than when the SI might hear one thing, they'll start working on it, and they'll hear something else, they'll start working on that too, even though there's a conflict in what those two messages are. And we start seeing that earlier when there's another set of eyes that helps assist in a project of this scale, right? Small project, 2-month project, don't need us, right? But if you're a multi-year engagement, you're going to have a lot of challenges in there that the SI is going to be focusing on just what they've been hired to do.
Right.
And the PM group, that might be the client side, doesn't know that where there's smoke, there's fire. They might think it's all related to the same fire, and it's not. And so we kind of bring that out, and data and people tend to be a big part of that, of challenges that maybe wait until the end of the project to start getting resolved. And by that time, it's too late.
Right. That's a great point. I want to get to a couple other comments here, and then I'm going to shift gears and talk about little here in just a second. Here's a comment from Victor on YouTube. Are you the dude who made the intro to logistics video? It might have been. I do have an intro to logistics video on my YouTube channel. If you liked it, then yeah, that was me. If you didn't like it, it must have been Scott or someone else. I don't know whose it was, but I'm not sure which logistics video, but yes, I have a logistics video out there as well. So this is an interesting comment from Andre on YouTube. Andre says, very few people understand demand management, and even fewer understand the implementation of it. Digital transformation, even fewer understand that. That was poetic.
Yeah.
It's almost like a poem. I feel like I need to save that. It's very true.
Spot on.
Yeah, well said for sure. I want to shift gears though and come to, and we've got a bunch of audience questions we're going to get to as well, but just to sort of set the context and get some themes out on the table here, I want to share this one too. And this is a really interesting one because for a couple of reasons. One is it's a massive failure. A lot of people know of this company, and this is a grocery retailer based out of Germany called Lidl, and they had a $500 million SAP project. It failed, and they pulled the plug on it, and I believe they're still in the process, or maybe they already have done it. They've gone back to their legacy system to sort of recover and get their operations stabilized. So they attempt to implement SAP. It ended after 7 years, approximately 500 million euros, I should say. I think I said dollars. It should be euros. How did resistance to change existing business processes contribute to this outcome? Because that was a big deal that they talk about in this article. But let's talk about resistance to change for a minute. How does that apply to Lidl here?
Well, it's amazing how many projects that we're on, even prior to me joining Third Stage, where the client says our primary focus is to use it out of the box. And that's usually the last time we hear that, because then when we get into the meat and the potatoes, especially even during the selection of a system, let alone the implementation, it comes back to, well, everything that we do is very unique to us, and we need the system to change to accommodate that. And when you start hearing that, the battle started. And what I would advise clients prior to even coming close to an implementation is to spend time internally to understand your end-to-end processes and decipher what is value add activities. Because we can get into another topic on robotic process automation and AI and those kind of things to handle the blocking and tackling within these systems. But really figure out, and this usually comes out during design sessions during an implementation. And by then, I think it's a little too late, of what really is unique to us. What is our competitive advantage? What is our secret sauce? And focus on if the current ERP platform that you're selecting or implementing can satisfy that secret sauce processes. If not, stay away from customization and focus on potentially another application that can fit that. Because everyone, I think even everyone on this session today knows that any kind of customization or far-reaching extensions of an ERP platform is going to cause problems when we get into enhancements and upgrades and things like that. So focusing on what's really unique and to your processes should happen, quite honestly, before the project. We see this happen a lot as well, of organizations dumping process improvement, process optimization during an ERP. And what that tells me is they're not going to take the standard out of the box processes. They're going to do a hybrid of what's out of the box, might do some customization or configuration or both, plus do some process changes, all happening at the same time. And that confuses the hell out of the workforce. And it probably doesn't get you to the end state you think it's going to get you. And in fact, one of the things that we advise clients, especially those that haven't gone through a big ERP implementation before, is to really assess all the other applications and projects you have going on and figure out how those are going to impact this project. So I know that the Lindell's project, I mean, it was massively long and to the point where you're probably putting in more and more money and time thinking it's going to fix it when it probably wasn't. And hence they pulled the plug and now they're going to kind of go backwards again. So really understanding what's going on. Even we have a client now that has a number of on-premise applications that may or may not interface to the new ERP. But they all have their own roadmap of migration to the cloud or enhancements or changes to it. And unless you get that all up front, as you get into the project, those things pop up and cause you to have to course correct a little bit too much. Oh, this upgrade over here is happening. We're going to replace this system. Did we know about that before we started this project? And if not, why didn't we? Because all those things are going to cause noise. They're going to cause noise, and the longer the project, the more of those things are going to happen, especially market changes as well. So not surprising when you have a 5+ year ERP implementation, you're going to have some changes and problems coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just, it blows my mind. I don't know about what you think, Scott, but I mean, it blows my mind to think about spending 500 million euros and then having to pull the plug. I mean, I guess where I struggle is like, how did you as a company, how did you let it get to that point? How did you not know $500 million in, or until it was 500 million euros in, how did you not know it was going to be a failure? I mean, it blows my mind. If you had the right governance in place.
So again, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say you might have pulled the plug earlier, or you might have course corrected, and you probably would have spent a lot less money if you would have done one of those two things earlier.
And you wonder if we've gone into assessment projects where we've asked for, okay, show us all your requirements, all your interfaces, and all the scope documents that you use to approve this project moving forward. And they're like, well, we're still collecting that. And you're like, you're still collecting requirements during the implementation? Well, yeah. I mean, it happens all the time. I'm like, yeah, but you're adding like 10 or 20 new requirements a month. That is not normal. So that urgency that we talked about at the beginning of this call, trying to get started, and we'll just kind of catch up as we get into it. There has to be something fundamentally wrong with the scope of the project for you to have spent 500 million euros, 5+ years, to have missed the mark, right? So looking back at what was the big areas that they kept churning. We have had one expert witness case that I've been involved with where the software truly was oversold. They sold some vaporware. They sold some development functionality that never came to fruition during the project. But that's rare. That's very rare. So for this to have gone that long, was it really the system that wasn't meeting your needs, or were you changing your mind or trying to force it into a hole that should never have been put in? So I'd like to believe it wasn't the application at this point. Unless you're trying to really push it beyond its normal use case and stick it in places that shouldn't have been put in.
Well, I mean, this isn't a no-name product we're talking about here. We're talking about SAP S/4HANA, and we're talking about a product, by the way, S/4HANA, that's being used by plenty of other retailers and distributors throughout the world. So to your point, it's probably not SAP. Now, someone may have done something to SAP to break it or to make it not quite fit what you wanted it to do, or maybe the functionality of SAP wasn't exactly what Little wanted or needed. That's a different story, but the software works. It's just a matter of, that's something you identify early on during the evaluation process. You should know that before you even start implementing. You should know that there is an issue or a challenge with the pricing margin analysis piece of it, and you should have a solution for that. It shouldn't be something you find out at go live. I mean, to me, that's just unacceptable. And the other thing that comes to mind is you talking about 500 million euros. How many stores could they have built for 500 million euros? Or, how many factories could a manufacturer build for 500 million euros? And by the way, if let's just say instead of spending 500 million euros on this SAP project, they decided to spend 500 million euros on opening new stores, I guarantee you they have enough corporate governance in place to where they would have not let those stores just go to waste and go way over budget, and then ultimately decide, well, screw it, we can't finish the building, we can't finish the store build out, so we're just not going to open it. I mean, you just wouldn't see that in a corporate setting, but yet companies do it all the time with these big ERP implementations. It blows my mind because it's like they treat other capital investments with such rigor and discipline, but when it comes to an ERP project, they just let these budgets spiral out of control with nothing to show for it. And I just don't understand it in some ways. But
well, there is the part of that story is that they Lindell is a little bit unique in their industry of how they price inventory. And out of the box was one form of pricing inventory, and they operate in a different way. So if that was fundamental to their business model, how did they start in the first place? Were they trying to force the application to change how it prices and values inventory to meet their business model? Maybe they should have gone to a different inventory warehouse management system that prices it the way they wanted it. So might be another, square hole, round peg kind of thing, or vice versa.
Yeah. And one thing you have to be careful of in those cases is, this is what drives me crazy about the industry, is that when that happens, where you've got this functionality that doesn't fit the way you run your business, a lot of times what you'll hear from software vendors and system integrators, you get this refrain that, well, you're just not willing to change. We have best practices built into our software and you just need to adapt to the software. And to me, okay, that's true in some cases. There's parts of your business where you probably can just adapt. You should just adapt the way the software works. But there's going to be use your words, the secret sauce. There's stuff that you do that you intentionally do differently from your competitors because you have a competitive advantage. I hope you have a competitive advantage. If you don't, then that's a whole nother conversation. But assuming you do have a competitive advantage, that's going to create strain and tension with your ERP system, because your ERP system probably can't give you all you need to address your secret sauce, nor should it. You shouldn't want it to, because if it could do that, that means all your competitors have the same secret sauce, which makes it not a secret sauce. So I don't know, that to me, there's a bit of arrogance. There's a bit of arrogance in the industry where we say, and when I say we, it's not us, because we're not affiliated with any of these vendors, but a lot of the vendors will say, well, you just refuse to change, just follow, adapt to our software. Why are you trying to be different? You're not different. And well, that's true when it comes to accounts payable, maybe, or, how to manage your GL, but that's not true when it comes to some of your areas of secret sauce. So,
Yep.
Interesting stuff. Now, here's a question that it actually came in a while ago, but it's sort of related to everything we're talking about here. And it goes back to the testing thread too, that we were talking about on one of the previous case studies. And this is from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian says, you pointed out that no system goes live without defects. It's just a matter of managing the risks. How do you help clients define what's an acceptable defect versus a critical issue that should delay a go live? I love this question. Hopefully,
I will say that one of the things that we establish up front is levels of escalation of everything. So what is a testing scenario that is critical versus low risk or low defect value? What justifies being brought up to the PMO meetings that happen on a weekly basis versus going to the steering committee for approval or discussion? So we lay that out right up front. And so some of the things that some of the driving conditions or questions about even whether I should do this project in the first place is a customer going to pay for it? Is it regulatory in nature? Is it our secret sauce? Those key things are critical. Not being able to close your books in 2 days after the end of the month, critical. Not being able to see the status of a shipment every hour of the day may not be as critical, right? As long as you get a daily update of where it is. So there's levels of criticality of everything, including, testing scenarios and what importance does a defect have in moving forward to the next stage. And in fact, we have a client now where we are, we've incorporated a second system integration test because the client is very adverse to having disruption in their business at go live. So it's adding another 3-4 months to the project, but it's important for them to get there. And so we hope and would expect that all even low and medium defects would likely get resolved during the second sit. So this should be a near perfect go live. For all the things that are tested. But to your point, Eric, we don't test every single scenario, and no new product launch tests every way you could use their product, right? Just what are the most common and the most important. But something that happens once a year most likely could work out or create a workaround if the system doesn't work exactly what it needs to when that event happens. But do you stop the implementation from going into production because of that once a year event that's not critical? Probably not.
Right. That's a great point. It also brings up sort of ties into this concept of customization, which we've been circling around this concept of customization. You've got customization, and then you've got just standard off the shelf software. And then obviously there's a gray area of a hybrid or of an in between. How do you see, or how do you advise organizations on how to find that right balance between customization and standardization?
Do we got another hour?
Yeah, I was going to say this is a whole nother, and that's the problem with most of my questions I have for you, which, by the way, just for the audience's edification or entertainment purposes, I sent Scott a list of about 15 questions I thought I'd ask him. I think I've gotten through about 4 or 5 of them, just because so many of these questions are so broad and we can go in so many different directions. But do your best, if you don't mind. Just how do you summarize that striking of balance? Does it tie back to that phase 0 planning piece of it that you were talking about before, or is there some other magic silver bullet here?
It does. We haven't even talked about business case and ROI and KPIs and all those wonderful metric type of things. But why are you doing this in the first place? Well, it might be, again, like I said, you're a legacy system that's end of life. You have to do this. So let's get some value out of it. But if you're a proactive organization that routinely looks at your processes and applications, you can tie into what is acceptable to change, what isn't, based upon what you're trying to get out of the project in the first place. So if you're just trying to keep the lights on, take whatever you can out of the box and just keep moving forward. But if it's something that you're an industry leader, and there are a number of processes that are quite unique, but you still need a new ERP, that might be, again, one of those cases where rather than customization, increase risk potentially by going to another application in that area. And I know we talked about demand planning. That's usually a case where if you're using demand planning now at a sophisticated level, probably an ERP functionality of a new platform won't meet your needs. So you're probably in that world where rather than trying to stretch the ERP's function around demand planning, look at another solution that will interface into the system. If you slice it and dice it and do a lot of things that are above what normal or basic organizations do on demand planning, change that. We see this very often in ERP implementations with smaller organizations where an HR and a CRM module in an ERP might be perfectly acceptable to them. But if you're on Workday, you're on Salesforce, you're not going to leave those platforms to go to the ERP functionality that's embedded, right? You're gonna have different mix of application layouts to meet your needs. And so if you're at a point where you're like, I only want one system in our entire company, you're gonna have to adapt to what they have and don't customize. But if you're in a much more complex, sophisticated user group, a single ERP platform likely won't work for you. You'll need a combination of different applications to work together for you to meet your whatever those KPIs and business case items were at the beginning of the project.
Right. Here's a question. It's kind of a bombshell in my opinion, but I've got to pull it up because it's such a. We could spend a whole hour on this topic too, and this strikes a nerve for me too. This is from YouTube. This person says, I'm 21 with 8 months of experience, and I feel my team's approach to stretching tasks for profit feels inefficient and makes me question if I'm being dishonest. And I just want to pull this up because I had the exact same experience when I first started in consulting. I felt dirty and gross, to use more technical term. I felt dirty and gross in the way we were expected to bill, regardless of value added. And when I was 24 years old, just out of grad school. And so I do think, I pull it up partially because it strikes a nerve for me. I can relate to this. I feel for you. I had the same feeling when I started my career in consulting, but I do think that this also contributes to some of the problems we see in the industry. You see these big system integrators, big consulting firms, and not just the big ones too, by the way. It's other mid-sized firms, and others are guilty of it too, to where it's in their best interest to stretch this out. I mean, whoever was the system integrator on this little project, for example, they benefited from the fact that this budget ballooned into 500 million euros. Client did not benefit, but someone did, and that someone is going to be SAP and the system integrator. So I think that's a broken part of our industry that's unfortunate. I don't know how you fix it other than regulate it, which I don't know if anyone really wants that, but it might be where we head someday. But in the meantime, I think it's sort of like not a buyer beware, but more of this is your project. Your contractors, your software vendors do not control this project, nor should they. They might try to convince you otherwise, but it's your project and you have to manage it. And if you're a consultant getting drug into the dark side, I don't know, come work for a company like Third Stage. We don't do that stuff. And in fact, I'm very anti that behavior, which is why I left the Big Five. I don't know if you saw that. Did you see that too when you were at the big consulting firms? Did you see that where you had these junior people that are just billing maximum amounts of time?
I mean, the whole goal is to make partner, right? And the only way to make partner is have increased revenue, and it's much easier to find scalability in an existing client than to land another one. So if I can continue to add bodies to this project and stretch it out more, I have a likelier, and that goes back to the human behavior again, right? I want to make partners, so I'm going to have my team operate in a certain way that I can drive my success.
Right.
And that might be then for the vendor itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to, and I know we're running way longer on time here, but if you don't mind, Scott, I've got one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask sort of a capstone question here. And I lost the question, so let me pull it up. So this is from Amy on LinkedIn again. Amy says, change management is the post-operative care that ensures that the patient survives, which I love that comment. And it sort of leads into a question I had for you, which is, we've talked a bit about change management and how change management appears to be a critical factor in these cases, in these three cases, and a lot of the failures we've seen, and a lot of the expert witness work we've seen. Change management is one of the core failure points. But what best practices can companies adopt to ensure successful change management during projects like these?
Well, not to preach or ring my own bell, but I focused my dissertation on the acceptance of technology in the workplace. So, what we try and encourage is, how is the organization going to operate and use the new systems post go live as early in the process as possible. So, process discussions, change management around what processes are changing, and educating the workforce around those changes as early as possible is the start of, I think, a proper change management methodology. Um, Training will happen throughout the project. The bulk of the workforce will be trained near the end, but it's educating folks during the engagement of how the world will be different in the future, especially if you are going to make some process changes. You're going to have multiple systems get introduced. Explaining and educating the workforce up front throughout the process is very important. In fact, we use process documentation even during the config and design sessions, right? So that the SI is very informed of what is in place today and what will change. But I think the change management aspects goes back to the KPIs, the case for change of, we expect this project to allow us to increase sales by 30% in the following year. How the hell are you going to do that? Just by a new system. So, so driving to how the system will support that, because it's a lot more flexible to allow us to, let's say an organization is huge on mergers and acquisitions. And so this system will allow us to buy our competitors or get into a market easier for doing that. So focusing on the change management of how to do that in the new system will just reinforce when you are doing that after go live. It's going to most likely meet your objectives. But I think that most of our clients are educated in that there will be a disruption in their business after go live, but they typically think that this change management happens once and you're done. And one of the things that I found on my research was frequent retraining, re-education on change management, and acceptance of feedback of how to continue to improve the processes and the use of the tools needs to be in place. What are the mechanisms for your workforce to be able to say, hey, I like what we're doing now, but this part of it really sucks. So how do I change that, right? How do we change that to make everyone happier about how using the system? And it's going to save 10 hours per person a week. Do you have a mechanism to accept that feedback, reintroduce it, come back with some changes, and move forward? So that goes back to, again, that transformation philosophy,
right?
Is that it's not one and done, right? This is multiple years, multiple projects of enhancements, changes, re-education to get you to where you're going to be. And wherever that is quite different for every organization. But change management is near and dear to, I know, third stage to myself. And it's not a single act in a project and you're done.
Right.
And one of the things that's disappointing is that when we go into clients, very few companies have a formal change management group or team available. And that shows how little they view this activity.
Yeah.
And yet the best system means nothing if people are disgruntled, they don't like how it was implemented, and they had no say in its design. The system means nothing now to the workforce.
Right. Yeah. No, I totally agree. And it's if you're going to invest all this time and money and heartache in a new technology, why not make it less stressful by investing in change management, which is going to make it a lot more successful. By the way, I'm going to ask, I've got a couple of last questions for you here in a second, Scott, but real quickly, I want to share for those that might be wondering, well, how do I avoid this kind of failure? You know, we've talked a lot about it, but how do we avoid it? I want to share with you guys a digital transformation report. We publish this each year. We put out an annual report that has top 10 independent reviews of top 10 software rankings in the market space, as well as trends in the digital transformation space, as well as benchmarks and data to really help you navigate some of these challenges. And what I'm going to do is this is the page you can go to register to read that. I'm actually going to pop this up on the screen here, a QR code that you can scan right here. Whoops, right here. If you scan that QR code that you see at the top left of your screen right now, just scan that. You can download the digital transformation report. It's got a lot more best practices in it and lessons to help you avoid failure in your digital transformations. But as people are scanning that and hopefully reading that or downloading it for future reference, Scott, what do you think is going to happen with digital transformation failure rates in general? Do you think it's on the rise? Do you think it's going to get better? What's your forward-looking prognosis here?
Good question. One of the things we didn't touch on is the quality of data and data management throughout this whole process. Because the reason I say that is a lot of these ERP applications or enterprise in general are introducing a lot of their automation, AI functionality in there. But if anyone's ever looked at Chat GPT and used it a couple of times, I love the disclaimer of like, the information may be incorrect. Don't use it. Don't plagiarize it. It may be false. You need to do your own research to find out whether it's true or not. I think a lot of organizations are going to be surprised because they're jumping on this whole AI world, and yet most of their infrastructure has redundant or old or bad data. And so these tools are going to leverage that infrastructure to give you recommendations or do work on your behalf. And yet you haven't really cleaned up your house in the first place. So I think we're still going through the blocking and tackling in a lot of cases. Obviously we can talk about Amazons and the like, where they have, 10,000 programmers, developing their own software and things like that. That's great. But most organizations that are in the business of technology still have a long way to go to get more modern systems and better data. That takes a little bit of that blood and sweat, and then you can leverage some of these unique and awesome tools that are coming out in the marketplace. So probably not going away anytime soon, just because I'm amazed even now that we have clients come into us and they're on 20, 30-year-old legacy systems still. And they're like, hey, we want to do AI. Can we do AI today?
No, it's the last thing.
Probably not on the mainframe system that you're on, but yeah. So I think there's still so many organizations out there that need to get more modern. And because they haven't done something like this in a long time, we're probably going to still see some of those failure rates at probably consistent levels for the time being.
Right. If you have an issue with this QR code, just go to thirdstage-consulting.com. And at the very top, just go to the resource center. It should be the first featured report you see is the 2025 Digital Transformation Report. By the way, if you go to that resource center, you can also get a guide to change management, which I know Scott was talking quite a bit about change management. There's a phase 0 implementation planning checklist you can download. How to choose a system integrator. There's a guide to successful SAP projects, guide to successful Oracle projects, all kinds of stuff that you can download for free. So just go to thirdstage-consulting.com if you want to check that out, if this QR code doesn't work in particular. But just as a closing question here for you, Scott, what if you were to leave the group here with 2 or 3 tangible pieces of advice to avoid failure, what would that be? What are the 2 or 3 things we need to, of all the stuff, great stuff you've shared with us here today, how do you narrow it down to 2 to 3 things that that's what you want us to remember?
Know your house is my first one. So before embarking on any kind of transformation or system implementation, know what's going on today. Know everything that you possibly can, what's happening today in your organization. And little side note, I'm still amazed. This is another thing that I'm still amazed with our clients is that when we get multiple departments in one room and talk about an end-to-end process, I'm still amazed at how often people are learning new things for the first time working with this team. So when that happens, I recognize that people really don't know everything going on in their house for this to be successful, because what that means is that once you start the implementation, everyone's learning new stuff still. And that shouldn't be the time where these things come out. So spend the time now before you embark on any kind of major project to get that team together and talk about end-to-end things of what's wrong and what's right. That will go a long way. But I also think that it's important for the organization to understand where they want to be when they grow up. And I maybe mentioned that a couple of times with you in the past, that where are you headed, right? But don't shortcut that. It takes a little bit of time to get there. So when we talk about project coordination, what's your first step? What's your second step? What are those projects that you can do sequentially, and what are those projects you can do in parallel?
Right.
And if it has to happen sequentially, then that's what has to happen. Don't try and speed it up because you want the end result soon.
Right.
That's going to get you in trouble. Our best clients, quite honestly, are those projects that are in failure mode and they hire us for the assessment. Yeah. And the only reason that's good is that they understand some of the things we're saying are true. Organizations that haven't started a project like this, they hear the concern and the caution and the guidance that we give. They tend to kind of, oh, whatever. And then we almost always get a call back.
Yeah.
A year later or 6 months later going, can you help us? So be smart and understand all the pitfalls of an ERP implementation first. Talk about it internally, then reach out to a firm like us to have a conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think right now we've got either 2 or 3 active clients that I know of in the last, say, 12 months that didn't choose us originally, or they chose not to bring us on 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And then they call us and say, hey, actually, we do want to bring you in now to fix some stuff that we screwed up along the way. I'm not saying you're going to fail if you don't hire third stage consulting, but to your point, a lot of times organizations, they have to go through the pain and learn it themselves. It's sort of like, when you have kids, when they're young, you tell them not to put their hand on the stove, and sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. But a lot of times you have to let them put their hand on the stove and burn it and realize, oh, when mom and dad were right, I shouldn't put my hand on the stove. And then they know, you can tell them next time, don't put your hand on the stove, and they're going to listen. But sometimes, unless you've been through it, you don't understand the urgency. And it makes it worse when software vendors and system integrators are whispering in your ear. If you're a less sophisticated implementer of technology, you get software vendors and system integrators whispering in your ear saying, hey, it's fine. We've got best practices. We've got a great implementation methodology. We've got the best people. You don't need to worry about that whole planning thing. You don't need to worry about change management. Our software is easy to use, blah, blah, blah. So you start hearing all this stuff. And I kind of understand in some cases where, to your point, if you don't have that experience level, if you haven't been through these battle wounds and battle scars in the past, you're not going to know. And it's all just academic, if you haven't been through it before in some cases. So, all right, good stuff. Well, thank you again, Scott. Thanks for being here. And thank you to the audience for the great questions. A lot of questions we didn't get to, but we're going to pick up on some of those questions and cover a couple additional things that we didn't get to in the interview here in just a moment. Stick around. We'll be right back. We're also going to get into the end of big consulting and why I think the end of big consulting is near. So stick around. We'll be right back. We're going to cover all that stuff here in just a moment. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'm excited to announce the release of our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's available now on the Third Stage Consulting website, www.thirdstage-consulting.com. This report gives you an unbiased, technology-agnostic insight to help you optimize your organization's projects for success. Get your copy today using the QR code in front of me or on our website.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry. engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 211. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting and produced by Major Tom Productions. So, Darian, we just had Scott on the show from Third Stage Consulting from our team here at Third Stage, and really interesting conversation. I feel like we had to cut it short, even though it wasn't a short conversation. But what were some of your thoughts or follow-up questions from that conversation?
Yeah, it was a great conversation. One thing that Scott mentioned, I guess that really stood out to me was how companies really rush through the planning phase because he said they feel like it's lost time. And they really want, to get to what they feel is the tangible stuff like designing, building, and testing. But then, it seems that every single time then they pay for it later when they hit major issues and they have to scramble to fix things before going live. I think this is something that we've seen often, but what do you think is the best way to shift that mindset within a company? And how do you get leadership to see planning as an investment rather than a delay?
Yeah, it's a tough question. We do struggle with this, quite frankly, because the human instinct, like we talked about in the interview, the human instinct is to just do something. We didn't get into it in the interview. I actually meant to bring it up, and then I got sidetracked by another question or another thread. But one of the things that one of our guests on the show brought up, I can't remember who it was. It was years ago, though, and it kind of stuck with me. And that is this concept of action bias. And I believe it's Christina Sariano. She's a professor at the Colorado State University, or she used to be at Colorado State University. Now I think she's at University of Georgia in the United States. But someone, believe it was her, was talking about action bias and how we as humans have this bias towards taking action. In other words, it may be in our best interest to do nothing. We may actually be making things worse by taking action in some cases, but we are going to lean towards taking action because that's who we are as humans. And I think that's what we get. That's where we get the best of ourselves here in these implementations, where we feel like, well, why waste? Why I put the word waste in quotes. Why waste 3 or 6 months on a planning phase if we can make more progress and get ahead by just starting on the technology work stream now? And that is true that in the short term, you will be faster and further ahead by starting now. But I can almost guarantee you with 99.9% certainty that longer term, you're going to be way behind if you just jump into the implementation. It's sort of like if you decide you're not going to warm up or practice or eat breakfast before a marathon. You're like, well, why eat, when I could just go start the race now? Or why sleep if I go do the race now? It's sort of that same mentality. It's like, yeah, you will start out ahead because you're starting now, but the fact you didn't sleep or eat probably is going to mean you're going to lose the race longer term. So that's the kind of way to think about it. And, the other way to think about it too is, when you build, and I was trying to do this a little bit with Scott, talking about when we're talking about Spar Group, I was talking about how, they spent 500 million euros on this SAP project that they have nothing to show for. I think of how many stores they could have opened, how many how many stores or factories could be built if it was a manufacturing company. And I think most leadership teams at a company that does big capital investments, they would have better governance in place and better planning in place around these other capital investments. But when it comes to IT and ERP and digital transformation, for some reason, they don't treat it with the same level of discipline and rigor as they do any other capital investment, like an acquisition or building a new factory or opening 100 new stores or whatever. They seem to manage those capital investments with much more discipline. And then when it comes to ERP implementations, they think, well, sure, let's just not worry about a plan. Let's just go build technology, which they would never do when they're building a factory. They would never do that without a blueprint and an architect and general contractor in place and all that stuff. So that's the way I would do, is try to tie it back to what they know makes sense in other types of investments and projects that they do. And I think intuitively they know that that's the right answer, but they don't apply that same concept to IT for some reason. They think of IT as it's just IT. It's different. Well, it's not. I mean, it's just because you can't see the technology in the same way you can see a factory doesn't mean you should treat it, with any less discipline. So you sort of have to speak their language, and it's a lot easier said than done. I struggle with this a lot because I end up dealing with the executive teams of our clients, especially our bigger ones, and it's hard to get that message to land.
Yeah, that's super interesting. One other thing that I found interesting, though, during this conversation with Scott was when you guys were talking about how organizations can be afraid to report the true status of their project as well. I think you said, everything looks green until suddenly it's a disaster. And it reminds me of some of the expert witness, I guess, cases that we've talked about, where the problems are building for months, but then leadership wasn't really getting the real story. What do you think, or why do you think that fear exists within companies? And how can companies create a culture where teams feel safe to be honest about the risks?
The key word you just said was safe. People don't feel safe sharing the real status. And I think the human nature of both your internal resources and especially your external resources, your software vendors, your system integrators, your VARs, whatever outside technical implementer is involved, there's a sort of self-preservation mindset that goes into it, where it's like, sort of like you or I, if we were to imagine right now, if we were to have a conversation of how's this podcast going? Is it going well? And let's just say it's a disaster. Our audience hates it. They hate the content, but you and I somehow sit here and we justify, like, well, no, we're having a good time. We're having a good conversation. We're enjoying it. You sort of, your mind goes there. You want to preserve or protect yourself in some ways. And so, a software vendor it's not going to be in their best interest to point out every single flaw and deficiency in the project. I'd be like you and I sitting here too and let's talk about all of our imperfections. Tell me, go Darian, tell me all the things that, all your weaknesses, and I'll tell you mine, which is going to take like 3.5 hours for me to talk about all the things that are wrong with me. So, you look at it from that perspective and it's just not comfortable, and people don't feel safe, to use your word. But I think you have to create this mindset and a culture on the project that we're not here to point fingers. We know this is going to be a challenge. We know there's going to be a ton of things that go wrong in this project, and we're not going to blame anyone. But the key is we need to recognize and identify it, because then if you ignore it, there's going to be a lot more people to blame and a lot more blame to go around if you don't identify it up front. So it's a lot less pain just to identify it up front and fix it, rather than waiting until some disaster happens and people start getting fired over it. So I think that's the key thing. Make it safe. Make sure you've got transparency and lines of communication through an objective channel, not through the software vendor, because they're never going to be the right party to self-grade their homework. You're going to need someone that can be more objective and impersonal, or not impersonal, but just less emotional about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess one follow-up question to all of this would be, is it the right move for executives to be asking for status reports to get more of an accurate picture of what's going on, or what should that process look like?
Yeah, I mean, status reports are important. So even though it's a flawed process on a lot of projects where there's a lot of false greens and false security you get from seeing green on a status report, it's not the status reporting or the status report itself that's the problem. It's the people providing the inputs to the status report. And so you need the people to be objective and independent. And also you need them to recognize where the risks are. The risks are not just with the software and the technology. The bigger risks are with the organization, with the operations, with the leadership commitment, with the user buy-in, all this stuff. That's that's where the risks are. But yet your software vendor and system integrators generally aren't looking at that. They're looking at the technical risks. So you need someone that's objective, unbiased. They're not there to paint a overly optimistic picture for the vendors. They're not, because the vendors are trying to protect their revenue stream. They don't want to put their revenue stream at risk. These are massive, profitable revenue streams for them. So it doesn't help them to point out the things they're doing wrong or the things that could be perceived as them doing it wrong. So you need someone that's independent and doesn't have that financial tie or that bias. You need someone independent to provide the reality of what's really happening. Maybe that green is not green, it's yellow. And that's okay. If it's yellow, that's fine. I mean, yellow is fixable. When it gets to red, that's a problem. So let's not let it get to red. Let's pick it up. Let's catch it at yellow and get it back to green, or at least know that it's yellow, know that we've got it under control longer term. So I think that's the big thing, is that independence and the inputs into the project reporting or the project status updates have to be unbiased and agnostic.
Yeah, absolutely. But what a great conversation with Scott. Like you said, I feel like every time he comes on, it's always a great conversation, and we hear a lot of different perspectives from him. So that's always nice.
Yeah, and I think we could take the audience questions we didn't have time to get to. We could take that, and that could be a whole nother episode right there with those questions, because there were so many great questions we just didn't have time to get to. But yeah, we'll definitely have him back. We'll dive into it in more detail. People seem to like talking about failures and case studies in general. So there's a lot to learn there, and we'll have him back on the show later in the year. But in the meantime, we're going to shift gears and talk about another, maybe it's not the most optimistic view of the world, but it's the end of big consulting, and why I think the big consulting model is flawed, and why I think it's failing us here in the 2020s, and why I think longer term it's not going to be viable. Either they're going to have to change, or they're going to not be relevant anymore. So let's roll this YouTube video that I recently published that sparked a lot of conversation, I would say, some positive, some negative, healthy conversation. But let's roll the clip, and then we'll discuss it here in just a moment. I started my career 25 years ago at one of the big consulting firms, PricewaterhouseCoopers to be exact. And the big consulting firms have been around for a long time. They've long dominated the enterprise technology space. Companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, Accenture, KPMG, Capgemini, those are just a few examples of some of the really big global consulting firms that have hundreds of thousands of employees at each of them and have long dominated the tech consulting space. But now that the world is changing, I'm starting to question the viability of this large consulting business model, and I'll talk about why that is here today. Now, while I'm going to share a lot of information about system integrators and large consulting firms here in general, I also want to invite you to download our annual digital transformation report. This is a great way to learn more about the industry, including the types of system integrators, the types of consulting firms that are out there for you to choose from, as well as the different types of software solutions that you might look into. The report also contains a number of best practices and lessons to ensure that your digital transformation or ERP project is successful. So I encourage you to download that report, which you can find right here with this QR code in front of you, or you can go to the links below. One of the biggest challenges and the biggest faults of big consulting firms is their biases. They are extremely biased towards certain software solutions. And this is something I learned really early in my career, and it's something that hasn't changed at all in the last 25 years that I've been doing this. Just to give you a quick example and a personal story here, back in the late 90s when I started at Price Waterhouse, I remember my first software evaluation and selection project. And we were paid around $1 million for this project was the estimated fees. And this was one of my first projects coming straight out of grad school while I was at Price Waterhouse. And I remember distinctly sitting down with the project team that was on this project. Most of them were older and more experienced than me. But I remember asking, which systems are we going to evaluate? What technologies are we going to consider for this client? And I was actually pretty excited to learn about different technologies that were in the enterprise tech space. And I got a very strange look when I asked the question. I remember the team looking at me almost as though I was speaking a foreign language or saying something that was completely crazy. And I remember the partner on the project telling me, there's no decision to make. We are recommending SAP. Now we need to spend the next 6 months justifying why we need to recommend SAP to this client. And I remember thinking it just didn't feel right. I felt a little bit dirty because I knew I was getting paid, the whole company was getting paid a lot of money to go through this evaluation and the selection and the set of recommendations. And we knew from day one that we were going to recommend SAP. And the reason we were going to recommend SAP is because the group that I was involved with was underneath the same management of the SAP practice. And so the way the business worked, at least in the part of Price Waterhouse that I worked for at the time, was that the teams that would do the software evaluation in the separate group over here were incentivized to sell and recommend SAP
which benefited this practice over here. And the two partners that were over each of those areas actually benefited from both of those. I believe the partner I worked for was incentivized and comped on how much SAP work that the other partner sold. So there's a lot of biases and misalignment and conflicts of interest that went along with that. And that's one of the big problems I have with the big consulting firms. And in fact, it was the origin of my original idea of starting an independent and tech agnostic ERP consulting firm. I actually first came up with that idea back in the late 90s when I started at Pricewaterhouse and during my tenure at Pricewaterhouse. Now, I assumed that over time, maybe there were other independent consulting firms out there I just didn't know about, or maybe this was just a problem with PricewaterhouseCoopers, but other firms weren't like that. But what I found over the next 10 years in my career after that was that that's just how the consulting space works. Consultants oftentimes either are incentivized to recommend certain solutions because they have big practices that focus on that solution, and or they're getting commissions from the software vendors to make the recommendations that benefit that software vendor. And we get approached all the time at Third Stage Consulting, vendors that want to offer us 10 or 20% of the revenue that they generate from our recommendations, and we give them a solid, stern no every time because we are independent and agnostic. So those biases that you see in the big consulting space is something that I don't think is sustainable, and I think it's something that will hurt the larger consulting firms in the longer term. Another reason why I think the big consulting model is not sustainable is because of the conflicts of interest that are inherent in the business model. Now, I talked about how many of the big consulting firms are incentivized financially to recommend certain products, and they benefit financially for that, and that in and of itself is a conflict of interest. But there's other conflicts of interest as well. One is that the big consulting firms have a pretty steep incentive to get as many bodies billable on your project as soon as possible. And it may sound normal enough. It doesn't sound like a big surprise. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that. That's their job, is to generate revenue for their organization. But your job as a CIO or as an organization that's investing in technology consultants to deploy technology, your job is to make sure that you're not minimizing cost, but optimizing cost and making the best use of those resources. And I remember distinctly when I was at the big 5 consulting firms back in the 90s, I remember having many internal conversations that we intentionally excluded the client from, where we were at the client site billing for our time, strategizing about how we could get more people on the project. In fact, that's how I got on my very first project at Pricewaterhouse. Is I had just come out of grad school, I had just gone through initial training, had never touched an ERP system in my life, had never been a consultant in my life until that moment. And I was put on a project where I didn't have anything to do for several months. It took a long time for me to get up to where I was actually working a full-time job. And during that time, I was expected to bill at least 50 to 60 hours. So I was billing for dead time because I was incentivized and I was expected and pressured to bill as much time as possible, even if I wasn't adding value. So that conflict of interest isn't in the interest of the client, but it certainly helps the big consulting firms. And another way that we see this conflict of interest manifest itself is that when you get a mid-size organization that's not a big Fortune 500 company, but they're a decent-sized organization, the big consulting firms will treat it like a big Fortune 500 company, and they'll try to staff it the same way. So let's just say they have some clients that are 100 billion or more in revenue, and they might put 200 people full-time on those sorts of projects. They'll try to put as many people as possible, or as close to 200 people as they can, on a mid-market company that might only be $5 billion. And that's just not cost-effective. It doesn't add value to the client. And long-term, customers are starting to figure this out, and that's why I think this model is outdated, and I don't think it's going to last very long. If there's one area where organizations in general have wisened up as it relates to enterprise technology projects and investments, it's that they're starting to recognize and realize that these big consulting firms are training grounds for new consultants. And that's okay. That's how I started my career. I got great training working at Pricewaterhouse, but I did a lot of that training on the dime of clients that were paying the consulting firm I worked for to train me. And a lot of that was on the job training. A lot of that was just my own inefficiency because I didn't know what I was doing when I first started. And so that's the kind of thing that I think will undermine the value that these big consulting firms provide to customers. In fact, they've always been undermining the value of that, but customers are now starting to see that and realize that. In today's day and age of AI and self-learning and self-development and professional development, CIOs and C-level executives are starting to recognize and understand that there's no need to have super junior people on a project doing documentation or doing research when a lot of that can be automated with AI and other technologies. So that's another reason why I think that the big consulting model is somewhat flawed and limited and inevitably will see its demise or at least some sort of major pivot in the future. Big consulting firms come with big price tags. I'm not just talking about the rates that they charge by the hour for a daily rate for the consulting services, but I'm also talking about the overall cost. And this goes back to a point I made earlier in this video where I talk about how there's a conflict of interest in terms of the big consulting firms putting an immense amount of pressure on their employees to put as many people as possible on any given project. This just jacks up the cost and raises the cost of the project. And big consulting firms are really good at playing politics and ensuring that the client doesn't necessarily understand or know how resources are being directed and the value that individual resources on a project are delivering to a project. What they do instead is they'll usually have a senior manager or a partner who's sort of the face of the team that will do all the interaction with the executive sponsors and the executive steering committee, and they do a really good job of selling the value of the team as a whole. But having been part of these teams and having still been involved with these teams now as an external third-party independent consulting firm, we see it all the time, where these big consulting firms put bodies on projects, but there's not necessarily any rationalization or validation of whether or not we need all those resources at that time. A lot of times what happens is these firms are so hell-bent on staffing up the project as quickly as possible and as fast as possible, as much as possible, that they put bodies on projects and ramp it up at a certain run rate that's not sustainable for that project long term. So in other words, you might have staffing levels like this, but really you might be able to get by with a lot less of a staff at a slower burn over a longer period of time. So those are the sorts of things you need to look at. Is you need to have visibility into the project plan, the resourcing plan, the budget, the staffing forecast for the project, and the way the consulting firm is managing their people. And this goes back to a point I make often in my videos and other thought leadership, in that organizations that are going through the implementation and hire these big consulting firms, or any consulting firm for that matter, they need to take ownership of the project and they need to manage those consultants the way they would manage any other employee or contractor or vendor. For some reason, organizations feel like they don't know enterprise technology, so they just defer to the big consulting firms, and big consulting firms are highly likely to take advantage of that in most cases. Now, this is probably the most controversial point I'll make in this video, and that is these big consulting firms are oftentimes very arrogant. They have a superiority complex that oftentimes leads them to look down on people that are not part of their team or the client themselves. And what that does is it leads to a lack of transparency with the client. So these big consulting firms, as a broad generalization, are good at telling customers what they want to hear. They're good at isolating them from issues that might be percolating under the surface. They're good at hiding inefficiencies of their own team. They're good at hiding mistakes that the team might be making. And what happens is organizations pay for this in the end when they find out that the project is off the rails, that they weren't notified of certain risks that were happening, and in many cases the fox was guarding the hen house. And this is why a lot of organizations will hire us as an independent tech agnostic firm to provide quality assurance and oversight and management of these big system integrators, because we are not only good project managers, but we also know what it takes to staff these projects appropriately, and we're only paid by the customers, our clients themselves. So our only incentive is making sure that the client is successful, and that transparency and that ownership is something that we give to clients, and that's something that they need, whether you hire a company like us or not. But I'm curious to hear what you think, especially if you've worked for a big consulting firm, if you've hired a big consulting firm. I'm curious to hear what you think. Do you think the business value is there? Do you think there's flaws in the business model? Am I crazy? Is there positive aspects of this that I'm missing here? I do think there's value in what big consulting firms can bring to the table, but I also think there's a lot of downside risk, and I don't think that downside risk is sustainable. So I'm curious to hear what you think, though. Is there something I'm missing? Is the benefit outweigh the cost and the risk? I'd love to hear your comments below, so be sure to leave those. I'd love to hear your feedback.
So that was a YouTube video I published recently about why I think the end of big consulting is near and what some of the problems are with the consulting model. What are some of your thoughts and takeaways from that video clip, Darian?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked the video. I thought it was great, but I want to actually point out something different. I want to point out some of the comments we got on the YouTube channel from this video, a couple one was from a Big Four employee or a former Big Four employee, and they said this is also true. Another was a consultant who worked for KPMG, Deloitte, IMB, Accenture for 24 years, they said. And they said it was the same everywhere they went, and clients don't really see what's happening. And then this last one really kind of stuck with me. It was, if I had $1 for every firm that called me to clean up the issues caused by these firms, I'd be retired. I feel like that last one is just such a good, encompass of all the different comments we got from people saying like, thank you, Eric, for bringing this to light, and agreeing with it. And I think that speaks to this really not being talked about that much, and how much of a problem it really is. I mean, the biggest takeaway, I guess, for me would have been how deep this bias really runs for these companies, and how it really seems like they're just selling instead of consulting a lot of the times. So I think there's a lot of problems that go within it. But I guess with so many ex-consultants confirming this, or current consultants confirming this, why do you think that companies are still, I guess you could say, like, falling for it?
Oh, man, that's a good question. So many different directions we could take that question. I'm trying to decide which, and I have very strong opinions about this whole topic, obviously, as you probably sense from the video. Well, first of all, let me say this. I was really surprised at how many people validated what I was saying. I expected there to be a lot more people coming to the defense of the big consulting firms. And there are some on there that and I think most of the counterpoints to mine were very respectful, and it wasn't like a lot of hate that I was expecting to get. It was more like, hey, this is, I appreciate your videos, but this is where I think you're wrong. This is the value that that big consulting firms can provide. But it was really interesting how many people just validated it all, in that, and why companies ignore it. I think it is such a rigged industry. I mean, it is such a masterfully constructed ecosystem of perpetuating self-interest that it's hard to break. And what I mean by that is, you think of like Accenture and Deloitte. You get all these people that work their butts off to get to partner. And then a lot of times those people, on their way up will move to other companies, and then they end up hiring that same firm because that's where they came from and all their buddies work at that firm. And so you get this sort of incestuous sort of mindset. And then you add to the fact this perception that no one ever got fired for hiring IBM, or no one ever got fired for hiring Accenture, which is total garbage, but it is the perception. Because you pick any one of those big names, I'll give you a list of CIOs who have been fired for hiring them. But yet people still have this perception that it's the safe bet. Or what's really interesting, and I didn't talk about this in the video, is what's really interesting is I feel like a lot of CIOs and organizations are so risk adverse. And this sounds sort of twisted and warped in some ways, and it is, but they're so risk adverse that they think they'd be better off failing by hiring a big name rather than taking the risk of failing by hiring a no name. And so I think there's sort of this resignation or this hedging mindset that goes into this, where a CIO says, well, this project is high risk and it's likely to fail. And if I'm going to go down in flames, or if it is going to run into challenges, I want to at least have covered my ass by saying, at least I hired IBM, or at least I hired Accenture. I hired a big name. I spent a lot of money. I did all the right things. But I can make a pretty strong case that you're actually doing the wrong thing, and you're making your odds of failure higher by hiring one of those big firms. So I don't know. I don't know if that really answers your question of why it is. But that's one of the dynamics we see, that twisted mindset of risk aversion, as well as the perpetuating self-interest. And then, the other thing I'd add in is that, these big consulting firms are just the masters of selling. I mean, they're so good at it. And in fact, I learned a lot about how to sell by working at one of these firms, because they're so good at it. And they're so good at spin. They're so good at protecting the client from the truth, protecting the client from inefficiencies, protecting the client from all the internal political crap that they do as big consulting firms. And they just have a good way of making clients feel good. While shit's hitting the fan over here, they have a good way of making the client feel good about it. And I don't know what it is. It's just sort of a political finesse that these big companies have. I saw it firsthand. I mean, if you're a partner, you're really good at that. You have to be good at that to be a partner at one of these firms. You have to be really good to take a shit show of a train wreck over here and make a client feel good about it or feel okay that everything's going to be fine. And they're just good at it. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I guess one question I have going off of that would be, I guess, if there is any trust being lost in these big firms, who's really filling that gap?
Well, I mean, our goal is to fill the gap, as a company at Third Stage. And that's why I started the company, is because I wanted there to be a really good alternative to the big consulting firms. In other words, I wanted us to be former Big Five consultants that are sort of jaded from having worked at these big consulting firms. And that's what a lot of our team is. And in fact, that is one of the critiques. That's probably the biggest criticism I got in that video was, well, you're just saying that because you are an alternative to the big consulting firms, and it serves your self-interest to convey that message. And that's true. It does help us. If people see what big consulting firms are all about and the real flaws and the warts with big consulting model, then yes, they are going to gravitate to companies like us. And yes, it's going to benefit us. But does that mean we shouldn't point out what everyone seems to be validating, which is the big consulting model kind of sucks? That's kind of what we're saying here. And it seems as though the market is agreeing with us, or at least people viewing the videos and consuming the content seem to agree with that. So, it's sort of like, it's a weird thing. It's almost like the biggest criticism we got on that video was, well, you're just saying that because it helps you. Yeah, it does. It does absolutely help us. But does that mean I shouldn't point it out? And so I guess that's the big takeaway for me there.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great video, though. Lots of things brought to light that I think are really interesting, and we don't hear a lot from other people. So that's always a good thing. But I guess I have one question, not for you, but for the audience, just to kind of get a little bit more insight, if we can. If you've worked with a big consulting firm, was it worth it, or did they sell you a solution before you even started? I feel like this would be a great question for our audience to answer and give us some insight onto, what have they experienced working with a big consulting firm?
Yeah. If you've hired one, or if you work for a big consulting firm, love to hear your experience. What's interesting too is that, back to the interview with Scott Janke talking about ERP implementation failures earlier in this episode, that comment that I brought up from someone who worked at a consulting firm that said, I'm 21 years old. I've only been doing this for 8 months, and I'm expected to, I forgot what the exact words they used, but basically I don't feel right about, the value I'm providing versus what I'm expected to bill. And that's exactly how I felt growing up in that space. But I thought it was interesting that we weren't even talking about this topic yet, but someone came out and brought that up as we're talking about ERP implementation failures. And I think there is a direct correlation between the self-interest of big consulting firms and the failure rates. I think that absolutely contributes to the failure, and their model is broken. And that's why I think it's not sustainable, and it's not going to last long. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, good stuff. Well, thanks for all the great insights from that clip, and thank you to the audience. I'm curious to hear what the audience has to say in terms of feedback and answers to your question there. Yeah, we'll have to pick up on some of those comments too in a next episode of the show too. So thank you in advance for any feedback you have there. But great show. Thank you for being here, Darian. Thank you to the audience for being here. Thank you to Dr. Scott Janke from Third Stage Consulting for being here today. If you'd like to learn more about Third Stage Consulting, again, go to thirdstage-consulting.com. You can learn more about our services and how we can help you through your independent digital transformation consulting needs, whether you're in the selection and strategy phase or whether you're in the midst of implementation, you're planning for an implementation. That's what we do. We help clients all the way through the entire digital transformation lifecycle. So feel free to reach out. I've included my contact information below as well. If you'd like to reach out to me directly and learn more about the company and how we can help, feel free to reach out. So hope you all have a great week. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place, transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can see all the past episodes in the meantime. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Take care.